Frank Mercer didn't believe in ghosts, but he believed in rust. Rust was honest. It was the slow, relentless death of metal, as inevitable as the economic decay that had consumed his city on the shore of Lake Erie. On the second night of his new job, night watchman on the decommissioned freighter Iron Pilgrim, he was making his rounds. The air was still and cold, smelling of diesel and rotting fish. On a crate in the hold, where he had left a heavy wrench half an hour before, there was nothing. Frank frowned, sweeping his flashlight into the corners. Nothing. He chalked it up to his own fatigue, deciding he'd simply forgotten where he put it. But an hour later, checking the locks on a cargo bay, he discovered the second disappearance. A heavy coil of mooring rope, too cumbersome for one person to carry off unnoticed, was gone from a storage locker secured with a padlock. The lock was still in place, cold and intact. Inside there was nothing but an empty circle of dust on the floor. In that moment, Frank's faith in the orderly world of rust and decay developed its first crack. 6 months ago, Frank had been a dock worker. His scarred hands remembered the weight of containers and the cold of steel cables in a winter storm. But the port had died. One by one, the Yeezy Moor cranes fell silent, and one morning his name was on a layoff list. Now his world was a tiny apartment with a view of the silent docks and the endless gray water. The job on the Pilgrim was a ros feros, demeaning handout from his former boss, a last chance to stay afloat. The freighter was a relic, a rusted skeleton waiting to be towed to Asia for scrap. To Frank, it was a symbol of right everything they had lost. Jobs, pride, a future. He slept during the day and spent his nights in the creaking belly of the dying ship, listening to the wind moan in the corroded rigging, and trying not to think about his bills. This was his normal life. The life of a man with nothing left but memories and debts. How to lend. On the third night, a fog came in off the lake. It didn't creep in. It advanced like a white wall, swallowing the lights of the far shore and the sounds of the city. It wrapped the iron Asporo schooner in Pilgrim in a thick, damp cocoon. Inside the fog, the sounds changed. The groaning of metal grew deeper, more prolonged, as if the vessel was moaning in pain. Frank stood on the deck, his winter grid flashlight beam carving out nothing from the swirling mist but trembling water droplets on the railing. The air thickened, carrying a strange, faint smell of ozone and wet iron. And then he saw it. A section of the railing, 10 yards away from him, hazed over, lost its definition and dissolved before his eyes, as if it were made of gray sugar. There was no sound, no splash. The iron fash, the metal simply ceased to exist, leaving behind only a gap in space that the fog immediately filled. Frank stumbled back, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was not theft, and it was not an illusion. The ship was being eaten by the very emptiness hiding in the fog. Fear drove Frank to seek answers. The next day, instead of sleeping, he went to the only working bar left near the port. Behind the counter was old Pete, a former lighthouse keeper whose memory was as much an archive of local legends as his skin was an archive of wrinkles. Frank, without going into detail, asked about the Pilgrim. The old man was silent for a long time, polishing a glass. And then he told him that 40 years ago, during one of the most brutal winter storms on record, the freighter had vanished from all radar, taking its entire crew with it. They searched for a week and declared it lost. Then, a month later, it reappeared, drifting near the harbor entrance, without a single soul aboard and covered in a layer of strange, unnatural frost that crumbled metal under one's fingers. The official inquiry blamed it all on a toxic gas leak that caused mass hallucinations among the recovery crew. But Pete, lowering his voice, whispered that the old dockworkers believed something else. They said the ship had fallen into a pocket at the bottom of the lake, a place where the water was colder and older than memory itself, and that it had been released as part of a bargain, that the ship wasn't saved, but loaned. And now, it seemed, the creditor had come to collect its property. That same night, the fog returned. It was thicker and darker, almost black, and it moved with unnatural speed. Frank had barely stepped aboard when the fog slammed shut behind him, cutting the gangway off from the pier. The ship shuddered through its entire hull. All around him was the sound of screaming metal. An unseen force was tearing out entire plates of the hull, twisting bulkheads. The deck tilted beneath Frank's feet. He realized the fog wasn't just weather, it was the entity from the depths. And it didn't distinguish between the ship and the man. It was simply taking what was its. The only way to survive was the gangway, no more than 30 yards away. But those yards had become an obstacle course on a disintegrating, agonizing vessel. Frank ran. A cargo winch crashed into nothingness beside him. A patch of deck beneath his foot grew soft and viscous like wet clay. He leaped, landing on trembling steel, feeling the cold, sucking breath of the void at his back. Without looking back, he reached the end and collapsed onto the wooden planks of the pier as with a final soul-tearing groan, the Iron Pilgrim was consumed completely by the fog. By morning, the fog had cleared. Where the rusted giant had stood just yesterday, there was only the smooth, serene surface of the water. The official report stated that due to decaying moorings, the freighter had broken loose and sunk in the deepest part of the harbor channel. It was never found. Frank received his final pay and a piece of advice to keep his mouth shut. He had survived, but the escape had left an invisible scar. He had become part of the story. The entity from the lake knew him now. He felt its gaze in every patch of fog, in every drop of rain, in the smell of wet asphalt. He could no longer look at the water. A week later, Frank packed his few belongings and bought a bus ticket west, heading deep into the continent, as far as he could get from the Great Lakes. He wasn't running from a memory, but from a promise he never made. He was running from the long shadow that stretched from the water, patiently waiting for the next time he found himself near the fog.